I'm Ashy, and I'm continuing my monochromatic watercolor series today. So as with all of the paintings that I've done in this series, I'm just starting by wetting up my paper very generously. So I'm just using a large flat wash brush and wetting it with clean water. Then I just drop in the color in the sky and I let it diffuse naturally into the wet paper just to give the impression of like clouds in the background. And then I add the horizon line with just some hints of like foreground foliage. And I didn't start with the sketch on this one because I'm really just going for like a spontaneous landscape and letting the watercolor really just rule the painting and take over. So I do at times tilt the page to force a bit more bleeding. And that actually here kind of results in a bit more natural looking reflection without having to actually touch the paper. And then I just kind of dot in some very light value color to create the impression of background trees without adding any detail. For the water here, I'm just adding, again, a really watery wash of that color in horizontal brush strokes just to give it the impression of some movement in the water. And I'm keeping a highlight kind of in the middle, leading the eye back to the gap between the two banks. I use a heat tool to dry the layers in between each one because it really speeds up the process a lot and I'm not very patient. So by using the heat tool, it really keeps me from going in too early on the next layer of paint and creating unwanted cauliflower edges. I really just wanted my layers crisp and kind of clean. And I didn't want any of the backgrounds or cauliflower edges in this painting specifically. Sometimes it's great, other times I don't want it. So for the background, I just add another very wet wash, light value of the foliage, and I'm just dabbing in the color, not creating any detail. So it's still really loose, but it just creates a little bit more depth in the background by having that extra layer. I do add a slightly darker value right along the edge of the bank and then kind of work that up so that it looks like some foliage or some grasses or something along the bank. And that creates that distinct line between the water and the bank. So just adding that slight detail there. When that's done, I create my focal point, which is a very large and really dark value tree. So I do the first layer and I'm using a large round brush and I'm just really like splotching the paint on there. I do drop in some darker values toward the center of the tree just to create shadows and depth. And really just keeping it loose though. It's just splotches. I'm not trying to paint leaves or anything. Then I dry it and add another layer of even darker value. And here I'm allowing the paint to run out on my brush and it's creating a nice dry brush effect, which gives it a little bit more texture and kind of gives it the illusion of more detail without having to work very hard. So dry brushing is definitely an excellent technique to use for foliage. I go back to a really light value and start adding just the slightest details into the background. So I want just a little bit of an indication of the tree trunks back there and some branches up through the tree, but it's super, super light value. It matches the value of the leaves back there so that it doesn't stand out, but it grounds those trees and makes them look more realistic, obviously having a trunk. And basically I just use more water in this wash to make it that light value. And I just work my way around the background trees, making sure that each kind of group of splotches has a tree trunk, basically. Nothing super planned out here. I'm just adding in some lines, basically. And then along the bank, I do kind of crisp up that edge again along the water line and then add just a little bit more texture into the ground part just to make it look like there's some grasses or something with texture there. And it kind of grounds the background and makes those trees look like they're sitting on something. So then I return back to my focal tree. So I remix that dark value, making sure that there's not a lot of water in it, and add the tree trunk. I'm using quick brush strokes here and creating some like broken edges and some texture with some dry brushing just to make it look a little bit more realistic. So that adds a variety of textures and values into the tree trunk. Again, without having to work really hard at doing it. So just letting the paint run out on the brush to create that variety. And then I create the reflection of the tree in the lake. So I did start wet on dry here, and I just matched up the shapes of the tree trunk branches and leaves loosely. I'm not trying to go for like a perfect replica here, but just loosely doing that. And then I use some clean water and horizontal brush strokes to create the illusion of some like ripples so that the reflection isn't too defined. So I could have gone in wet on wet here, and so I could have wet the area first and then did my reflection. I chose to kind of start with wet on dry and then add water later to blend it out. And then I dry it and add another layer of darker value here. So just like I did in the tree, I'm building up layers to create a little bit more depth and intensity into the reflection as well. And then I add a really dark value for the foreground bank to kind of ground the painting and add a little bit more interest into the foreground. This also gives me an area that I can add like detailed grasses and just more texture. I also added just a little bit of light value grasses like peeking up out through the water. And that, again, just adds a little bit more interest and a little bit more texture into the foreground or the front part of the painting. So it helps with that illusion of depth by having more detail toward the bottom, which is the closest to us or the front of the picture. So I keep working just on this foreground and add more and more brush strokes just to build up both the texture and the intensity, depth of color. So I just do a lot of layers here with that. And I'm making sure that there's minimal water in this mix so that it stays dark, and because I'm not like waiting and letting it dry in between. You see, I do use the heat tool a little bit, but I want to make sure that there's not a lot of water in my paint so that it keeps that darkness and that heaviness to it. So after I kind of build up enough texture there, which does take a little while because I'm mixing darker and darker values, I add kind of just really, really dark along the bottom and then without much texture. And then I just put in some like blobs of paint on the top of some of these grasses. And that kind of makes them look a little bit like maybe cattails or some other kind of thing that grows next to rivers. I don't know, but it just adds a little bit more detail and texture. And then finally, I wanted to add a stork into this painting. So I start with a really light value and just paint in the shape of a stork. And the shape I'm pretty happy with, actually. It's a decent shape for this bird, and without having drawn it first, it's just a silhouette. But I don't feel like it fits here. It doesn't look right. It looks out of place. So I erase it, basically. So after kind of getting it in there, again, I decided that I didn't like it. So this is not dry yet. That's important. So you see, I dab out the darkest color, and then I take some clean water and just throw it onto the part that I didn't like, which was the bird. And then I just dab it up. And because this color is not super staining, and because I didn't wait for it to dry and I used a really light value, I was able to basically erase that part of the painting and then go back in and add in some of the grasses back. But I did still want some birds, so I put some birds super faintly in the background just to give it a little bit of life. And that's it. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it and have an awesome day.